Shortly after 8:30 a.m. on May 18, 1980, following an earthquake with a magnitude of 5.1 on the Richter scale, Mount St. Helens in Washington state erupted in one of the greatest volcanic explosions ever recorded in North America. The eruption would quickly become the deadliest in U.S. history, killing 57 people. The destruction caused more than $1 billion in damage. The blast was estimated to have the power 500 times greater than the Hiroshima atomic bomb. On November 4, 1980, Ronald Reagan, the former governor of California, beats President Jimmy Carter and independent candidate John Anderson in a landslide victory, ousting the incumbent from office. Reagan won just over 50% of the vote, while Carter captured 41%. Anderson finished with only 7%. In the Electoral College, the scale of Reagan's victory was dramatic, 489 to 49. Carter became the first elected incumbent to be defeated for re-election as president since Herbert Hoover lost to Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1932. So quick and decisive was the verdict of the American people that Carter delivered his concession speech before the polls had even closed on the West Coast. Nearly 5 months after President Reagan's election, a deranged man named John Hinckley Jr. makes an unsuccessful assassination attempt on President Ronald Reagan, injuring Reagan, Press Secretary James Brady, and a police officer. President Reagan would go on to win re-election in another landslide victory against Democrat Walter Mondale in November of 1984. In the early morning hours of April 12, 1981, NASA launched its first space shuttle mission, carrying astronauts John Young and Robert Crippen into orbit. Space Shuttle Columbia was the first shuttle to reach space when it was launched from NASA's Kennedy Space Center that early spring morning. Columbia carried dozens of astronauts into space over the next 2 decades. England's Prince Charles married Lady Diana Spencer in Westminster Cathedral in London on July 29, 1981. 2 million spectators lined the route of Diana's procession from Clarence House, with 4,000 police and 2,200 military officers to manage the crowds. 3,500 guests made up the congregation at St. Paul's Cathedral, and an audience of millions watched the royal wedding on live TV. The cost of the wedding was later estimated to be $48 million in total, between $70 and $110 million when adjusted for inflation. On September 21, 1981, Sandra Day O'Connor is approved unanimously, 99-0, by the United States Senate to become the first female U.S. Supreme Court Associate Justice in history. The 8-bit home computer Commodore 64, commonly known as the C64, was introduced by Commodore International on January 7, 1982, at the Consumer Electronics Show in Las Vegas. It was a machine with remarkable market success. The machines were released onto the market in August of that year at a price of $595. For a substantial period of time, between 1983 and 1986, the Commodore 64 dominated the market with between 30 and 40% share and 2 million units sold per year, outselling the IBM PC clones, Apple computers, and Atari computers. During its lifetime, sales totaled some 17 million units, making it the best-selling single personal computer model of all time. On December 2, 1982, American heart surgeon William DeVries implants Jarvik 7, the world's first permanent artificial heart into the chest of Seattle dentist Barney Clark. He will survive another 112 days. The second recipient went on to live for 620 days. In the 3 subsequent recipients, one died from blood loss, and the other 2 lived for 10 and 14 months. On June 18, 1983, Sally Ride becomes the first American woman in space when she and 4 others are on board the second flight of the Space Shuttle Challenger. On January 28, 1986, the U.S. Space Shuttle Orbiter Challenger exploded shortly after its launch from Cape Canaveral, Florida, claiming the lives of 7 astronauts, including Krista McAuliffe, a schoolteacher from New Hampshire. The Chernobyl disaster was a nuclear accident that occurred on April 26, 1986 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in Ukraine, then in the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, part of the Soviet Union. Following the reactor explosion, which killed 2 engineers and severely burned 2 more, a massive emergency operation to put out the fire, stabilize the reactor, and clean up the ejected radioactive material began. During the immediate emergency response, 237 workers were hospitalized, of which 134 exhibited symptoms of acute radiation syndrome, or ARS. Among those who are hospitalized, 28 died within the following 3 months, all of whom were hospitalized for ARS. It was considered the worst nuclear power plant accident in history and is the only Level 7 event on the International Nuclear Event Scale. On December 8, 1987, Reagan and Gorbachev signed the INF Treaty in Washington, D.C. The final treaty eliminated an entire class of nuclear weapons, restricting the deployment of both intermediate and short-range land-based missiles worldwide. This included all 1,752 U.S. and 859 Soviet missiles in the 300 to 3,400 mile range. On December 21, 1988, Pan Am Flight 103 crashed over Lockerbie, Scotland, as a result of a terrorist attack. While the aircraft was in flight over the Scottish town of Lockerbie, it was destroyed by a bomb that had been planted on board, killing all 243 passengers and 16 crew in what became known as the Lockerbie bombing. The Exxon Valdez oil spill was a terrible disaster that occurred when Exxon Valdez, an oil tanker owned by the Exxon Shipping Company, spilled 11 million gallons of crude oil into Alaska's Prince William Sound on March 24, 1989. It was the worst oil spill in U.S. history until the Deepwater Horizon oil spill in 2010. The Exxon Valdez oil slick covered 1,300 miles of coastline and killed hundreds of thousands of seabirds, otters, seals, and whales. On June 12, 1987, more than 25 years after the Berlin Wall first divided the cities east and west, U.S. President Ronald Reagan gave a famous speech in front of the Brandenburg Gate in Berlin, challenging his Soviet counterpart Mikhail Gorbachev by declaring, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall." Only a few years later, on November 9, 1989, it was not Mr. Gorbachev, but the German people who finally tore down the barrier. The Berlin Wall, after 38 years of restricting traffic between the east and west German sides of the city, begins to crumble when German citizens are allowed to travel freely between East and West Germany for the first time. One day later, the influx of crowds around and onto the wall began to dismantle it, thus ending its existence.